Today's story is about Silas Bennett, an enslaved boy in 1877 who saved the plantation mistress from a wild bull. And what happened afterward shocked everyone who witnessed it. This is a tense and emotional story. So, take a moment, breathe, and listen carefully. Before we begin, make sure to subscribe to the channel and write in the comments which city and country you're listening from. Your participation helps keep these stories remembered instead of buried. Let's begin. The blood was still warm on his back when they dragged him to the auction block for the second time in his life. Silas Bennett was 16 years old, and he had just learned the cruelest lesson of the American South, that saving a white woman's life could be a worse crime than letting her die. This is the story of a boy who spoke to animals better than he spoke to men. Who committed the unforgivable sin of heroism in 1877 Georgia and who transformed from the gentlest soul on the Callahan plantation into something the night itself learned to fear. Georgia, 1877, the year the North gave up on the South. Federal troops had withdrawn 3 months earlier, ending what historians call Reconstruction and what white Southerners called occupation. In Washington, politicians shook hands over a compromise that abandoned 4 million freed people to the mercy of their former masters. Rutherford Hayes took the presidency and the South took back its old ways. For people like Silas Bennett, freedom was a word that existed only on paper yellowing in some distant courthouse. His father, Moses Bennett, had signed what the white landowners called a sharecropping contract in 1868. Moses couldn't read the document he marked with an X, but the white man who held the pen assured him it was fair. The contract bound the Bennett family to work Henry Callahan's land until they paid off their portion of seed, tools, and the shack they lived in. The debt never got smaller. It only grew. Every harvest season, Moses would stand in the plantation office while Callahan's overseer, a narrow-faced man named Garrett, ran his finger down a ledger and announced the family owed more than they'd earned. The price of seed had gone up. The quality of cotton had gone down. There were fees for the mule, fees for the plow, fees for living on land that used to be worked by people who weren't paid at all. Silas had been born into slavery in 1861, too young to remember the war, but old enough to understand that the chains on his family now were made of paper instead of iron. They cut just as deep. The Callahan plantation sat in the red clay hills of central Georgia, 3,000 acres of cotton fields, timber stands, and pasture land. The main house was a white column structure that had survived Sherman's march by pure geography, standing proud on a rise that overlooked the worker quarters below. 73 families lived on Callahan land in 1877. All of them black, all of them bound by contracts they couldn't read and debts they couldn't pay. But Silas Bennett didn't spend his days in the cotton fields. He had a gift that even Henry Callahan couldn't ignore. The boy could speak to animals. Not literally, of course. Silas didn't hear voices or receive messages from the spirit world, despite what some of the older workers whispered when they saw him calm a wild-eyed stallion with nothing but his hands and his voice. What Silas possessed was something rarer than magic, something that couldn't be taught or bought or bred into a person. It was pure empathy, an ability to read an animal's fear in the tension of its muscles, its rage in the flare of its nostrils, its pain in the way it held its weight. He moved among horses, cattle, and dogs like he was one of them, speaking their language of breath and posture and careful stillness. When Silas was 11 years old, Garrett had brought a new stallion to the plantation, a magnificent black Tennessee Walker that Callahan had purchased at auction in Atlanta for $200. The horse was beautiful and completely unmanageable. It had kicked 2 experienced handlers and bitten a third. Garrett was preparing to have the animal gelded and broken with the traditional methods employed throughout the South: rope, whip, and the systematic crushing of its spirit until nothing remained but obedience born of terror. Silas had been mucking stalls when he heard the commotion in the paddock. He climbed the fence and watched the stallion rear and scream, eyes rolling white with terror. 3 men with ropes were trying to corner it against the back wall. The horse's fear was so thick, Silas could almost taste it, metallic and sharp like blood in his mouth. He'd climbed into the paddock before he'd even thought about what he was doing, moving on pure instinct. The men shouted at him to get out, their voices harsh with anger and alarm, but Silas ignored them completely. He walked toward the stallion with empty hands and downcast eyes, making himself small, making himself safe, making himself into something that posed no threat. He didn't approach directly, but at an angle, giving the horse space to move, space to choose, space to understand that flight was still an option. When he got within 10 feet, he started humming. A low, tuneless sound that came from deep in his chest, a vibration more than a melody. The stallion's ears swiveled toward him like compass needles finding north. Silas stopped moving and kept humming, letting the sound fill the space between them. He didn't look at the horse's eyes, knowing with the certainty of long experience that direct eye contact meant challenge in the animal world, meant threat, meant the possibility of violence. Instead, he watched its feet, its breathing, the gradual softening of the muscles in its neck as the terror began to drain away degree by degree. 5 minutes passed in absolute silence, except for that low humming. Then 10. The other men stood frozen against the fence, barely breathing, afraid to move and break whatever spell the boy was casting. The stallion took a step towards Silas, then another, its nostrils flaring as it caught his scent, and found nothing there to fear. 15 minutes later, Silas had his hand on the horse's neck and was breathing in rhythm with the animal, their lungs rising and falling together like dancers moving to music only they could hear. The men with ropes stood watching, their mouths hanging open in disbelief at what they just witnessed. Henry Callahan himself had been watching from his position at the fence, having come down from the main house to check on the progress with his expensive new acquisition. He was a tall man, 53 years old in 1877, with iron-gray hair and the bearing of someone who'd never questioned his right to command. He'd owned enslaved people before the war and owned their labor still, just under a different name and a different system of accounting. He was not given to displays of emotion or surprise, but what he'd just seen had genuinely impressed him. "Well, I'll be damned," he said, his voice carrying clearly in the sudden quiet of the paddock. "Boys got the touch, seen men work with horses for 40 years and never develop what that child just did natural." From that day forward, Silas Bennett became the Callahan plantation's primary animal handler, pulled from the cotton fields where his parents and sisters still labored, and given sole responsibility for the horses, cattle, and the plantation's pack of hunting dogs. It was better work than picking cotton under the brutal August sun, though Silas was careful never to appear too happy about his position, never to show too much pride or satisfaction. Showing pleasure in anything was dangerous for a black boy in Georgia. Happiness could be taken away as quickly as it was given, and often was, just to remind you of your place in the order of things. Silas lived for the hours he spent in the stables and pastures, the early mornings and late evenings, when he could work with the animals in relative peace. Animals made sense to him in a way that people never had and probably never would. A horse didn't care about the color of your skin or the circumstances of your birth. A dog didn't change its feelings based on who was watching or what social rules might be violated by simple affection. When a cow was frightened, you could see exactly why and address the cause directly, honestly, without having to navigate the complex and often deadly social codes that governed every interaction between black and white in the post-war South. Animals were honest in their needs and clear in their communications. They might be dangerous, certainly, their power and instincts making them potentially deadly, but they were never cruel. They never hurt for the sake of hurting. They never punished you for things you didn't do or couldn't control. The same couldn't be said for men, particularly white men in Georgia in 1877. Garrett, the overseer, watched Silas with the permanent suspicion that white men of his type carried like a weapon, always loaded, always ready to fire. He was 34 years old, rail-thin from a constitution that couldn't seem to hold weight no matter how much he ate, with tobacco-stained teeth and a voice like rocks scraping together in a dry riverbed. Before the war, he'd been an overseer of enslaved people on a plantation in South Carolina. After the war, he drifted west to Georgia and found work overseeing sharecroppers. The only difference to him was paperwork and the fact that he couldn't legally kill the workers anymore. Though the convict leasing system that had sprung up across the South provided workarounds for men who understood how the new system really worked. Garrett didn't like that Silas had a special position on the plantation. He didn't like that Henry Callahan sometimes spoke directly to the boy instead of going through proper channels and the established hierarchy. Most of all, he didn't like that Silas was good at something Garrett himself could never do, that the boy possessed a skill that couldn't be learned through violence or intimidation or the assertion of white superiority. Boys got ideas above his station, Garrett told the other white men who worked the plantation, the overseers and foremen who gathered in the equipment shed to drink whiskey and complain about the workers. Thinks he's special because he can sweet-talk a horse. Needs to remember his place. Remember what he is. But as long as Silas kept the animals healthy and productive, Callahan protected him from Garrett's worst impulses and his desire to cut the boy down to size. The plantation owner was above all things a practical man, more interested in profit than ideology. He'd paid good money for his breeding stock, hundreds and sometimes thousands of dollars for individual animals, and the Bennett boy kept them in prime condition. The other person who noticed Silas, though for entirely different reasons, was Eleanor Callahan. She was 26 years old in 1877, married to Henry Callahan for 8 years, and profoundly lonely in the way that only women of her class and time could be, isolated by the very privileges that were supposed to make her happy. Eleanor had been raised in Savannah society, the daughter of a cotton merchant who'd survived the war by selling to both sides and asking no questions about politics or loyalty. She'd been educated at a finishing school run by French nuns, trained in piano and watercolors, and the elaborate social rituals that governed the lives of Southern ladies. She'd first noticed Silas Bennett 3 years earlier in the summer of 1874, watching from the veranda as the boy worked with a particularly difficult mare in the training paddock. The mare had been abused by her previous owner, a man who'd lost the plantation in a card game and sold off his stock before the new owner could claim it. She would strike out with her hooves at anyone who approached, her eyes rolling white with remembered terror. But the Bennett boy had spent hours, then days, then weeks, just sitting in the paddock with her, not moving, barely breathing, simply being present until the mare got used to his existence. Eleanor had watched the entire process unfold over the course of a month, fascinated despite herself. She'd seen patience and gentleness in the way the boy moved, qualities that were rare in the harsh world of the plantation. She never spoke to him directly. The social distance between a plantation mistress and a black worker boy was an unbridgeable canyon. She simply observed from her elevated position and felt a strange envy for the purpose and skill she saw in his work. The spring of 1877 brought unusual heat to Georgia, temperatures climbing higher and earlier than anyone could remember. By mid-April, the thermometer on the plantation's main porch was already reaching into the high 80s by midday, and the red clay earth cracked and dried like old leather. Water became precious. Tempers shortened. Henry Callahan had invested heavily in expanding his cattle operation over the winter. Among the new arrivals was a massive Spanish bull, a fighting breed imported at great expense to improve the herd's stock. The bull was a creature of pure, condensed power, nearly 2,000 pounds of muscle and bone and coiled rage. He was kept in a specially reinforced paddock far from the main barns, a solitary king in a pen of his own. His name was Diablo, though only the workers called him that, and only in whispers. Silas had been given primary care of the animal, a testament to Callahan's trust, or perhaps his disregard for the boy's safety. One afternoon in late April, the heat lay over the plantation like a sodden blanket. Eleanor Callahan, driven by a restless despair that the closed windows and drawn curtains of the big house could not contain, decided to take a walk. It was an impulsive, uncharacteristic act. Ladies did not walk alone, especially not in the areas where the livestock was kept. But the rules of her prison had become unbearable. She needed air that wasn't perfumed with potpourri and polish. She wandered further than she intended, past the gardens, past the training paddocks, following the shady path that led toward the back pastures. She carried a parasol, but it was little defense against the hammer blows of the sun. It was there, near Diablo's paddock, that her lace hem caught on a fallen branch. With a sigh of frustration, she bent to untangle it, her back to the heavy wooden fence. Inside the paddock, the great bull had been lying in the scant shade of a lone pine. The movement, the flash of white fabric, something, triggered him. With a deep, ground-shaking bellow, he charged. The old timber, stressed by the heat and dry rot, gave way with a sickening crack as 2,000 pounds of enraged animal hit it at full speed. Eleanor turned at the sound, her world narrowing to the sight of splintering wood and the black mass erupting through it. She froze, the parasol slipping from her numb fingers. The bull shook its massive head, planks falling from its shoulders, its hot breath puffing in the dust. It pawed the earth once, twice, then lowered its head, aiming the terrible points of its horns directly at her. Silas was in the nearby stable, checking a mare's hoof. He heard the crash, the bellow, and then a high, thin scream that cut through the heavy air. He knew that sound. It was the sound of pure, human terror. He dropped the hoof pick and ran. He came around the corner of the barn to see the bull, free of its pen, beginning its charge toward the frozen white figure of Mrs. Callahan. There was no time for thought, only for the language he knew. He did not run toward her. Instead, he ran at an angle, placing himself between the bull and the tree line, and he began to make a sound. Not a shout, but a low, guttural call, the sound of a challenger, of another bull. Diablo skidded to a halt, his charge broken. His head swung toward this new interruption, this small, dark creature making big noises. Silas stood his ground, his body angled, his arms spread wide to look larger. He locked eyes with the bull, a direct, dangerous challenge he would never make with a horse. But a bull was different. A bull respected dominance. "Ho!" Silas yelled, his voice firm and deep, slapping his thigh. "Ho there, look here." The bull snorted, confused, its aggression divided. It took a step toward Silas, then swung its head back toward Eleanor, who had sunk to her knees, paralyzed. Silas moved again, circling, always keeping the bull's attention. He grabbed a broken plank from the fence and waved it, not to strike, but to create a distracting movement. "Yah, over here." He was in the bull's world now, speaking the only language that mattered in this moment, the language of threat and territory. For a full minute, they danced, the massive beast and the slender boy. Silas led the bull's rage in a slow circle away from the mistress. When the bull made another feint toward Eleanor, Silas did the unthinkable. He charged. He took 3 running steps straight at the bull, screaming, waving the plank, becoming the most immediate, most infuriating threat. The bull turned fully to him now, committed. As it did, Silas threw the plank aside and sprinted not away, but toward the broken fence, toward the opening of the paddock. The bull followed, its focus now entirely on this audacious creature. Silas dove through the broken gap, rolling in the dirt inside the pen. The bull plunged in after him. Outside the fence, Eleanor Callahan was safe. Inside, Silas was trapped with an enraged animal in a confined space. He scrambled to his feet, backing toward the far corner where the water trough stood. The bull advanced, slower now, confident it had its quarry cornered. Silas reached the trough and did the only thing left. He climbed in, sinking into the cool, murky water up to his chest. The bull stopped at the edge of the trough, puzzled by this change. It snuffed at the water, its nostrils flaring. Silas went perfectly still, his head barely above the surface, his eyes downcast. He began to hum, the same low, vibrating hum he had used on the stallion years before. The bull paced back and forth, but the charge was gone, the immediate rage dissipated by confusion and the barrier of the water. After what felt like an eternity, the animal turned away, walking back to the center of the paddock to stand guard over its territory, its flanks heaving. It was over. Garrett and 2 other field hands arrived first, drawn by the noise. They found Eleanor Callahan sobbing on the ground and, looking through the shattered fence, saw Silas standing up in the water trough, dripping and shivering in the heat. Garrett's face, initially alarmed, settled into a hard, unreadable mask. He helped Mrs. Callahan to her feet. "Get the boy out of there and mend that fence," he barked at the hands, his voice devoid of any relief or gratitude. Then he led the trembling mistress back toward the big house. Silas climbed out of the trough, the adrenaline fading, leaving him cold and empty. He had done it. He had saved her. The other workers looked at him with a mixture of awe and profound pity. They understood the landscape of this world better than he did in that moment. The summons came that evening. Silas was to present himself at the back porch of the main house. He washed as best he could and put on his only other shirt, the rough cloth scratching against his skin. Henry Callahan was there, along with Garrett and a pale, composed Eleanor. She would not meet his eyes. Callahan spoke first, his tone that of a man settling a business account. The boy showed presence of mind. Prevented a tragedy. The bull is valuable stock. Might have injured itself. There was a long silence. Garrett cleared his throat. He also put himself in a position of extreme familiarity with the mistress, sir. Forcibly laid hands upon her person to push her from harm's way. This was a lie. Silas had never touched her. But the lie hung in the air, poisonously plausible. Eleanor said nothing. She stared at a point somewhere past Silas's shoulder. To acknowledge the truth, that a black boy had saved her, that she owed him her life, would violate the deepest social order. It would make her indebted in a way that could never be repaid or even acknowledged. Her silence was her agreement. Callahan's jaw tightened. The practical value of the boy warred with the unspoken law. A black male could not be a hero to a white woman. The story, if told that way, was more dangerous than the bull. It undermined everything. I see, Callahan said finally. He looked at Silas not with gratitude, but with calculation. The boy's miraculous skill had just become a liability. Your debt is cleared, he said to Silas, as if granting a great boon. Your family's contract is void. For a second, hope, wild and unbearable, flared in Silas's chest. Freedom. Then Callahan continued, turning to Garrett. Take him to town tomorrow. See if Miller at the stockyard has need of a handler. Or the rail company. Get a fair price. He was not freeing Silas. He was selling him, settling the account by disposing of the problem. The blood on Silas's back, still warm from an earlier beating for some minor infraction, seemed to burn. He had saved a life, and the reward was to be severed from his family and sold like the bull he had just mastered, for the crime of having been seen, of having acted, of having made a white woman's life indebted to his. The next morning, they dragged him to the auction block. Not the slave block of old, but its legal descendant, the hiring fair for convict labor and indentured servants. As he stood there, the crier listing his skill with animals, Silas Bennett looked out at the faces of the white men bidding. The gentleness in him, the language he shared with creatures, closed down. Something harder and colder took its place. He had learned the final lesson. In the world of men, there was a kindness more fatal than any bull's horn. The kindness that forced the powerful to see what they had done, and who had really saved them. He was sold to a railroad camp in Alabama. The story of the bull and the mistress became a twisted folktale on the Callahan plantation, told in whispers. They said Silas had made a pact with the animal that day, that he had taken some of its rage into himself. They said the boy who spoke to animals was gone, and in his place walked something the night itself learned to fear, a man who now understood the nature of beasts, both animal and human, and who had learned perfectly how to survive among them.